Hey there, sleepless rabble. Tonight's story is real. No fantasy, no folklore. Just one woman, one verdict, and a country that looked the other way. Switzerland, home of chocolate, cheese, and quiet repression. In 1782, they executed someone for witchcraft, because progress takes time, especially in the Alps. We're going to dive into the story of Anna Göldin, a woman they called a witch and turned into a warning. If dark history helps you sleep, like, subscribe, and support the rebellion at kofi.com/napmax. And before you drift off, what scares you more? Superstition or silence? Let me know in the comments if you're still awake. This is Napmax Sleep Stories, and you're listening to Anna Göldin, the last witch execution in Europe. Let's begin. In the latter half of the 18th century, Europe saw itself as moving forward. The Age of Enlightenment promised reason, science, and progress, at least on paper. Philosophers were publishing bold ideas about human rights, the limits of power and moral freedom, while in France, the first cracks in absolutism were beginning to show. Pause. But enlightenment is no switch you flip. And it was far from evenly distributed. In many corners of Europe, the old ways clung on like frost in the shadows. Superstition lived on, well-dressed, well-spoken, and quietly persistent. Pause. Switzerland, perched on its mountains and content with itself, sat somewhere in between. No kings, no revolutions, just a loose alliance of cantons, each with its own laws, its own religion, and its own deep confidence in being right. Pause. The canton of Glarus, small and proudly Protestant, took its moral code seriously. Here, virtue was law, labour was devotion, and control passed for care. People trusted in God, in daily bread, and in everyone knowing their place. Pause. This was a society that believed itself to be upright. And like so many such societies, it feared deviation more than it loved compassion. Anything unfamiliar, noisy, or unexplained wasn't curious or welcome, it was dangerous. Something to be corrected or removed. Pause. Into this world, balanced awkwardly between philosophy and fear, came a woman who didn't quite fit. Not because she demanded attention or made a scene, but because she didn't disappear. She was present, flawed, stubborn, poor, female, and too visible to be safely ignored. Pause. Her name was Anna Göldin. She would go down in history. Not as a heroine, not by choice, but because someone needed to be made an example of. Pause. Not yet, though. Before Glarus sat in judgment, we need to understand where she came from, what shaped her, and why she never really stood a chance. Pause. But households are fragile things. They run on routines, on secrets, on the polite fiction that everything is fine. And sometimes all it takes is one cough too many, one strange coincidence, one child falling sick, and suddenly, someone must be at fault. Anna didn't know it yet, but the moment she stepped into that house, her story had already begun to rot beneath the floorboards. Pause. Anna Göldin was born in 1734 in Senwald, a small Swiss village near the Rhine. Like most places of its kind, it didn't offer much beyond hard work and a narrow future. Her family was poor, her childhood short, and any dreams of something larger than duty were best kept to herself. There was no romance in growing up as a weaver's daughter. Just the slow, unglamorous education in obedience, resilience, and staying out of the way when men spoke too loud. Switzerland at the time was a patchwork of cantons, each with its own rules and temperament, but all shared one thing. They had no space for women who didn't fit the mold. Girls were expected to be useful, quiet, and grateful, especially if they came from families who owned nothing but their name. Anna learned quickly how to move through other people's houses without leaving a trace. She became a servant early, switching households often, learning the unspoken rules of every room she entered. Who was allowed to make eye contact? Who wasn't? When to answer? When to pretend you didn't hear? She had a quick mind, sharper than her employers liked, and she wasn't afraid of using it when she felt it was necessary. But she also knew when to fold it away like laundry. Not because she lacked pride, but because she understood exactly how little room there was for women like her to be anything other than useful. Even so, her independence made some uneasy. She spoke plainly, held her ground when accused unfairly, and didn't pretend to be dumber than she was. That alone was enough to make her seem dangerous in the eyes of people who had never needed to explain themselves. At some point, whether by love, force, or circumstance, she had a child, a daughter. She raised her alone, without a husband's name to shield her, and in doing so crossed an invisible line in a society that tolerated widows but distrusted unmarried mothers. Anna didn't ask for sympathy. She kept working, she kept moving, life didn't allow much else. When she accepted a new position in Glarus, it was neither special nor unusual. It was another job, another family, another set of quiet expectations. She arrived with nothing more than a suitcase and a reputation that hadn't quite caught up with her yet. Pause. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that this would be her final post. That the place offering shelter would, in time, offer something else entirely. By the time Anna made her way to Glarus, she had already learned how to survive without expecting much in return. She had lived in other towns, Altstetten, Zurich, places where her labor was accepted but never truly welcomed. A maid like her wasn't expected to stay long anywhere. She was part of a floating class of women whose names were barely remembered once they moved on. But Anna left impressions, even when she tried not to. She asked questions. She saw more than she should, and she didn't always know when to pretend otherwise. Glarus was smaller than the cities she had passed through before, but it was no less proud. Nestled between steep mountains, it presented itself as orderly and upright, with a deep sense of religious virtue. It had been Protestant since the Reformation, and wore its morality like a well-worn coat. Practical, severe, and never out of season. The people here valued discipline, thrift, and silence, especially silence. Anna arrived in late spring. She came alone, her daughter left elsewhere for safety, or necessity, or both. The journey was long, though not unusually so. What was different this time was the feeling she had as she entered the town. Something she couldn't quite name, but which followed her closely, like the smell of rain after a dry week. She had been hired by a respected family, the kind that didn't normally take in maids with complicated histories. But the wife was practical, and the doctor, her husband, seemed indifferent to background as long as the work got done. They needed someone, and Anna needed work. It was as simple and as fragile as that. The house stood at the edge of the main street, clean and self-assured. White shutters, polished windows, the kind of place where everything had its place, and was expected to stay there. Anna didn't mind. She had seen worse. She had endured worse. Inside, she kept to her routine. She worked long hours, followed instructions, spoke only when necessary. No one in the household gave her trouble, not at first. There were children, polite and pale. The doctor spent most of his time in his study. The wife managed everything else with the tight control of someone who feared what people might say. Should things slip even slightly out of place? For a while, things seemed to go well. The work was hard, but familiar. The rules unspoken, but clear. Anna knew how to read a household without needing to be told, and so she settled in, cautiously, as much as someone like her ever could. Pause. She didn't know it yet, but her presence had already changed the temperature in the room. Not by doing anything, just by being there. The house belonged to Dr. Jakub Tschudi, a man known in Glarus for his education, his calm demeanor, and the mildly condescending way he corrected people in conversation. He was considered a modern man, literate, methodical, respectable. He had studied medicine, owned books in multiple languages, and spoke with the slow precision of someone convinced that facts were more important than feelings. But modernity, as it turned out, was selective. For all his learning, Tschudi still kept one foot firmly planted in the old world. He believed in order, in hierarchy, and in the unspoken understanding that a man like him was not to be questioned, least of all by a servant. His wife, Anna Katarina, was less of a mystery. She was the kind of woman who could run a household with one hand and manage the family's social reputation with the other. Nothing escaped her notice. She noticed Anna Göldin immediately, not with hostility exactly, just the kind of measured distance reserved for someone tolerated, but never truly trusted. Anna worked mostly in the kitchen and upstairs rooms. She rose early, kept to herself, and avoided unnecessary contact. It was the safest way to exist in a house where the rules were unwritten, but heavily enforced. The doctor rarely spoke to her except to give instructions or corrections. The children were more curious, sometimes watching her work with the quiet intensity of those who sense something adults don't say aloud. At first, there was nothing unusual. Anna was competent, efficient, invisible when she needed to be. But there was something about the house itself, its stillness, its carefully managed quiet, that made her wary. The kind of atmosphere where any sound, any slip, might echo louder than intended. Dr. Tschudi spent much of his time in his study. The door was usually closed. No one disturbed him unless absolutely necessary. He saw patients, kept records, and wrote letters in tight, perfect script. He believed in evidence, in cause and effect, in the structure of things. And yet, as Anna would later learn, his belief in structure didn't stop at science. It extended to people, to roles, to punishment when needed. What she also didn't know, couldn't have known, was that this man of logic would eventually become the architect of her undoing. Not with violence, not with shouting, but with careful words, quiet choices, and the full weight of a reputation that needed protecting. Pause. The first signs were small, barely visible, unless you knew what to look for. The Tschudis had 3 daughters, but it was the youngest, Anna Katarina, named after her mother, who drew the most concern. She was about 8 years old at the time Anna Göldin joined the household. Thin, quiet, and pale in a way that made people speak in lowered tones. She was not ill exactly, but never quite well. There were days when she seemed to drift, her eyes unfocused, her limbs heavy. She complained of stomach pains, of strange sensations in her throat. Sometimes she coughed, sometimes she trembled. At first, the parents responded with the expected calm. The doctor administered mild treatments, herbs, infusions, supervised rest. He took notes, kept records. The symptoms were vague enough to provoke worry, but not yet alarm. Children were often fragile, especially girls. The body was temperamental. It would pass, but it didn't. The episodes became more frequent, more dramatic. Anna Katarina began claiming that pins were appearing in her mouth. Sharp, metallic things she claimed to have coughed up. One was found, or said to have been found, on her pillow. Another in her bread. The girl said nothing at first, then everything. That something felt wrong. That something was inside her. That it wasn't her fault. And slowly, the atmosphere inside the house began to shift. Whispers started before accusations. A sense of discomfort. Of unease. Anna, the maid, began to notice it in the small things. How the wife looked at her longer than before. How the older daughter avoided speaking to her directly. Rooms felt colder, conversations shorter. There was no open confrontation, just distance and dread. The girl grew more frightened. And the more frightened she became, the more attention turned to Anna. She had done nothing. Nothing strange, nothing forbidden. But she was there. She was always there. And in a house that had begun to fear the inexplicable, presence alone could become a kind of guilt. Dr. Chudi, for all his training, began to speak less as a physician and more as a father. And a frightened father, especially one with a public image to maintain, is a dangerous man. Pause. Soon, the sickness would no longer be the child's. It would become a stain on the woman who served her. In a place like Glarus, people didn't need to say things out loud to make them real. A glance held a meaning. A pause in conversation could shift the balance of a room. And silence, when carefully applied, was often more effective than accusation. Anna noticed the change long before anyone admitted there was a problem. The girl's strange illness had stopped being just a medical issue. It had become a story, one that grew in the telling. Servants in other homes were starting to ask questions. The baker's wife had heard something. Someone at church had looked at her differently. People didn't confront Anna. They simply began to expect things of her. Explanations, apologies, confessions she hadn't made. She kept working. What else was there to do? She scrubbed floors, washed linen, prepared meals for a family that had stopped speaking to her unless absolutely necessary. The wife's tone became clipped. The children kept their distance. And the doctor, who once viewed her with vague indifference, now avoided eye contact altogether. There had been no accusation. Not yet. But the air was heavy with it. The girl was still unwell. Still speaking of pins, of strange feelings, of something she couldn't explain. And Anna's name was now tied to those symptoms in ways no one wanted to put in writing. She tried to speak once, quietly, to the doctor. Asked if she had done something wrong, if there was some misunderstanding. He didn't answer. He simply looked at her, nodded slightly, and turned away. That was when she knew. The story had already been written. She just hadn't been informed. Pause. Outside the house, nothing had changed. Inside, everything had. And Anna, caught between suspicion and silence, had nowhere left to stand. Outside the Chudi home, the town of Glarus continued its careful rhythm. Markets opened, bells rang, people exchanged greetings laced with judgment. It was a community built on quiet discipline and mutual surveillance. No one admitted to gossiping, but everyone knew everything. Word of the strange illness in the doctor's house had begun to spread. Not loudly, not directly, but through the small channels that always carry the most weight. The kind of channels where I heard was always followed by something damaging, and you didn't hear it from me meant exactly the opposite. No one accused Anna outright, but they didn't need to. The girl was still sick. The pins were still appearing, and Anna, for all her silence, was already marked. Inside the house, something had shifted in a different direction. Dr. Tschudi had begun to watch her. Not with suspicion, at least not the same kind his wife now carried, but with a quiet interest that Anna noticed and tried to ignore. It wasn't overt, just the way he paused when passing her in the hallway, the way he asked her questions that didn't quite relate to the work, the way he sometimes lingered longer than necessary when she served him tea. Anna wasn't naive. She'd worked in too many homes not to recognize the pattern. The soft, indulgent tone, the careful distance, the implication. She didn't respond. She didn't have the luxury of reacting. All she could do was remain neutral, polite, invisible, at least as much as that was still possible. His wife, however, had begun to stiffen. Her instructions grew sharper, her eyes colder. She watched Anna too, but not with interest, with calculation. Something in her posture had changed, and though she never spoke of it directly, Anna could feel the weight of her disapproval increasing by the day. The child, meanwhile, grew more distressed. The pins continued. The symptoms worsened. And in a house where no one trusted the others fully, fear became the common language. Pause. Outside, the town began to murmur. Inside, something far more dangerous was taking root. Anna was let go on a Tuesday. There had been no incident, no raised voices, no broken rules. Just a soft shift in atmosphere that had been building for weeks. Too subtle to name, but impossible to ignore. The lady of the house called her into the kitchen, offered a seat she didn't take, and explained, in careful, even tones, that the family was making changes. The illness had caused strain, she said. Finances, staffing, responsibilities. It was all becoming too much. They needed to simplify. Pause. Anna listened without responding. She didn't argue. She knew better than to demand reasons that wouldn't be spoken aloud. The words were polite, measured, almost gracious, but they hung in the air like a closed window on a warm day. Something not quite right, and entirely unmoving. Pause. She packed her things in silence. There wasn't much. Just the essentials, worn from years of use, and just enough for someone never meant to stay long. No one offered help. The doctor remained upstairs. The children watched from a distance, half curious, half confused, as if sensing that something had gone wrong, but not knowing which part of it wasn't allowed to be spoken. Pause. The final farewell came at the door. The mistress nodded, her expression blank. Not hostile, just distant. Like someone already forgetting what had been in front of her. No accusations, no explanations. Only the quiet relief of a problem being removed before it could name itself. Pause. Outside, the street felt colder than it should have. Anna walked with her head down, not because she felt ashamed, but because she could feel the stares she wasn't supposed to notice. People didn't need proof to form opinions. They only needed proximity, repetition, and a convenient target. Pause. She didn't know where she would go next. There was no plan, only the space left behind by a decision made long before it was spoken out loud. Pause. And somewhere behind her, in a room she would never see again, a child continued to tremble. And no one asked why. Long pause. Naples was just a few miles north of Glarus, not far in distance, but far enough in feeling to make a difference. It was the kind of town people passed through without noticing much. Smaller, quieter, tucked between valleys where the roads curved like old thoughts no one had bothered to straighten out. Pause. Anna didn't go there with any great plan. She needed work. And Naples offered a handful of households that might hire a maid without asking too many questions. She arrived alone, carrying nothing but what she could afford to keep, and a name that was beginning to follow her more closely than she liked. Pause. At first, she found a kind of uneasy peace. The house she entered was simpler, less formal. The woman who ran it seemed tired, practical, and too busy with her own affairs to worry about Anna's past. For a while, things settled. The work was hard but familiar. There were fewer eyes on her, fewer rules to navigate. It felt, if not safe, then at least breathable. Pause. But Glaris was not far behind. Whispers travel faster than people. What began as a murmur in one town becomes a knowing glance in the next. Someone always knows someone. A baker's cousin, a travelling pastor, a merchant with too much time on his hands. Stories grow legs. And Anna, without even speaking, was once again becoming a subject of interest. Pause. No one said it to her face, but the signs returned. Conversations paused when she entered the room. Questions she wasn't part of. Children who had once watched her with curiosity now seemed to avoid her entirely. Something was seeping into the air, and it was beginning to stick. Pause. She considered leaving again, moving further, perhaps across the border into somewhere anonymous. But travel took money, and suspicion had a way of catching up. And so she stayed. For now. She worked. She listened. And she waited. Though she didn't yet know for what. Pause. The storm hadn't found her again. Not yet, but it had started looking. Long pause. The knock came early in the morning, just after first light, when the streets were still empty and the world not yet fully awake. Anna had been preparing the kitchen, already halfway through her routine, when the footsteps approached the door, firm, official, and too many for it to be anything ordinary. There was no accusation at first. The men who entered spoke in formal tones, polite but detached. They carried papers with seals, words she couldn't read and didn't need to. She had seen enough of the world to recognize what this was, even before they said it out loud. She was to come with them. No one in the house intervened. The woman she worked for stepped back into the hallway, her hands clasped, her mouth a tight line of relief she tried to hide. Anna didn't resist. She wiped her hands on her apron, removed it slowly, folded it once, and set it on the counter. Then she walked out of the house and into the waiting day, flanked by silence and uniformed men. Pause. They didn't shackle her. Not yet. That would come later. For now, there was a kind of ceremony to the moment, as though everyone involved wished to preserve the illusion that this wasn't what it was. A removal. A quiet extraction of someone whose presence had become too uncomfortable to leave alone. Pause. Word travelled fast. By the time they reached Glaris, eyes were already on her. Not openly hostile, not yet, but curious. Too curious. There was no hiding now. Her name, already brittle from weeks of whispering, had cracked wide open. People didn't need details. They only needed the sight of her being escorted through town to know what kind of story they wanted to tell. At the courthouse, she was placed in a small room, left alone for hours. No one explained anything. No charges were read. Just a growing sense that something had moved out of her control and was not going to return. When someone finally spoke to her again, it was not to ask what had happened, but why. And behind the question, though no one said it aloud, was a second one. Why had she stayed so long when she must have known this would come? Pause. She was not yet a criminal, not officially. but the room already felt like a cell. Long pause. The process was never about finding out what had happened. Not really. The wheels had already been set in motion, and what followed was more performance than investigation. There were questions, yes, but they were framed in ways that didn't leave much room for answers that would change anything. Officially, Anna was not being charged with witchcraft. That would have been too medieval, too embarrassing in a Europe that liked to think of itself as enlightened. Instead, the accusation was more practical, more respectable. She was suspected of poisoning the child. It was a clever charge, vague enough to be flexible, serious enough to justify consequences, and convenient in that it allowed for the same fear and spectacle as a witch trial, without the theological awkwardness. After all, this was 1782. Switzerland had universities, printing presses, natural philosophers. They couldn't burn a woman for sorcery, but they could still destroy her for disturbing the social order. Pause. Anna was questioned again and again. Her routines, her time in the Tschudi household, her behavior, her movements, her words. Each answer she gave was written down, analyzed, compared with the memories of people who had already decided what they believed. Even silence, in some cases, was recorded as suspicious. Witnesses were called. Some spoke confidently, others reluctantly. A former servant mentioned that Anna had once muttered something under her breath when she thought she was alone. A neighbor claimed she had seen her walking through the garden at an unusual hour. No one claimed to have seen her harm the child, but no one defended her either. Pause. And through it all, the doctor remained distant. He did not accuse her directly. He let the process unfold around him, contributing only what was necessary, never more than what would appear appropriate. It was, in its own way, an act of self-preservation. A man of science, maintaining the image of reason while stepping quietly aside as the mechanism turned. Pause. Anna answered with what she knew. She denied the charges. She explained herself clearly. She did not plead. She did not weep. But the room heard none of that. What they heard was her tone, her confidence, the way she refused to be frightened on command. And that, more than anything, seemed to confirm their suspicions. The courtroom was not a stage. It was a funnel, and Anna was already at the narrow end. In theory, the trial was meant to uncover facts. In practice, it revolved around the appearance of certainty. There were no fingerprints, no laboratory tests, no medical consensus. What there was, instead, was the testimony of a child, the silence of a household, and the convenience of a maid with no defenders. Pause. The pins were central, of course. The child had allegedly coughed them up. Sharp, metallic objects that should not have been there. One had been found in her bread, another on her bedsheet. The doctor had recorded the events with clinical precision, sketching symptoms in neat handwriting, as if the act of documenting might protect him from the absurdity of what he was implying. But the deeper truth was simpler. The pins were never confirmed to have come from inside the child. There were no witnesses to the moments they supposedly appeared, only the girl's word, and the adult's willingness to believe her. Pause. Anna denied everything. She had prepared the child's food, yes. She had cleaned the linens, yes. She had been present, yes. But no, she had never harmed the girl, never touched the bread once it was baked, never put anything into the child's mouth except a spoon or a prayer. She didn't say it bitterly, just plainly, because there was nothing else to offer. Still, the court asked, if not her, then who? and in the absence of an answer, they built one. Pause. They brought out old stories. A previous employer who claimed Anna had once been difficult. A woman from her home village who remembered her as clever with her words. A vague report of an argument with another servant years ago, in another town. Nothing that proved guilt. Everything that suggested it. Pause. Belief in Glarus had never required fire and brimstone. It only needed a room full of people who were too afraid to admit they didn't know what was happening, and too proud to consider that they might have made it worse. Anna stood in the middle of it all, calm, unmoved, and that too was noted. Long pause. Because in moments like these, a woman's guilt was often measured by how little she wept. They never called her a witch. Not officially. That would have been embarrassing, unfashionable even. By 1782, Europe liked to think it had moved past such things. Enlightenment thinkers filled their libraries with rational treatises. Clergy softened their sermons with metaphors. People had started to look down on trials soaked in superstition, as if those belonged to another time, another continent, another kind of people. Pause. But fear rarely cares about language. It simply adapts. And the fear in Glarus had found a new vocabulary. Anna wasn't accused of casting spells. She wasn't charged with flying, or speaking to spirits, or making pacts in the dark. But she was accused of manipulating forces she should not have touched. Of influencing the child's body in ways no doctor could explain. Of causing harm with no visible weapon. Pause. And really, what difference did it make what they called it? The mechanics were the same. The isolation, the suspicion, the unspoken certainty that this woman, this servant, had crossed a line. That she had reached into a space not meant for her, and had to be punished for it. Not for what could be proven, but for what was felt. For the discomfort she caused in others. For being too composed, too hard to pity, too unwilling to collapse under the weight of accusation. Pause. The court avoided words that sounded too ancient. But the logic was old. And it worked. Witnesses spoke of her eyes, of her presence, of the heaviness in the house when she was nearby. They said she made them uneasy, that she knew things, that the child had never suffered like this before she arrived. It was not about evidence, it was about atmosphere, and atmosphere, once thick enough, becomes a kind of truth. Pause. The term witch never entered the official records, but it hovered over every page. It stained the air in the courtroom, and it settled into the bones of the verdict, long before anyone wrote it down. Long pause. Beneath the courthouse in Glarus, there was a room. It wasn't particularly large. Stone walls, low ceiling, no windows. The kind of space that had no official name because naming it would have required admitting what it was for. It wasn't spoken of in public, but everyone knew it existed. It was simply there, part of the building, part of the process. A place where answers were shaped, not found. Pause. When Anna was taken down into that chamber, the trial was already past the point of doubt. What followed was not about discovery, but confirmation. The men who oversaw the questioning didn't consider themselves cruel. They followed procedure. They asked their questions. They gave her time to respond. But when those responses failed to match expectations, they had other methods. Pause. She was bound, though not brutally at first. They were careful, respectable, methodical. They began with posture, forcing the body into positions that became unbearable if held long enough. Then they waited, listened, asked again, and again. Pause. Anna did not confess. They moved on. Water, sleep, time. A slow wearing down of the edges until memory blurred and pain began to fill the spaces where language used to be. Somewhere along the way, under pressure no one later documented in full, she said what they needed her to say. Yes. She had placed something in the child's food. Number. She didn't know why. She had felt something come over her. She hadn't been herself. She regretted it. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Pause. The confession was copied into the official record, phrased in the careful, tidy language of bureaucratic mercy. The document didn't mention the ropes, or the sleepless nights, or the long hours in the dark. It simply stated that the accused, of her own will and conscience, admitted her actions. A clean sentence, on a dirty page. By the time the verdict was discussed, the outcome was already understood. No one needed to say it aloud. The courtroom had grown quiet in a particular way, the kind that settles when a performance nears its end and the conclusion has already been agreed upon backstage. What followed now was formalities, meetings, signatures, the careful folding of guilt into law. They didn't call it a witch trial. That would have been vulgar. Instead, they cited poison, influence, manipulation of the vulnerable. It sounded cleaner that way, more aligned with the sensibilities of a progressive Europe. But the result was the same. Anna sat through the proceedings with the same expression she had worn for weeks, neither broken nor defiant. Simply still. She listened as men discussed her as though she weren't in the room, describing what she had become in their eyes. Dangerous, deceptive, unnatural. And because she did not cry or plead or beg, her stillness was added to the list of things that made her suspicious. The sentence, when it came, was delivered with measured solemnity. She was to be executed, not burned. That would have attracted too much attention. But beheaded, quietly, with as little spectacle as possible. They framed it as justice, even mercy. A clean death, they said. Humane. No one objected. No voices rose in her defense. The girl who had once trembled in her presence remained silent. The doctor said nothing. The town, with all its order and pride, nodded silently from behind closed shutters. The decision was made, and once it was, the rest moved quickly. Pause. It would happen soon. No appeals, no delay, just a date, and the sound of footsteps on stone. Long pause. The day of her execution began like any other. The sky was grey, the air cool, and the town as quiet as it always had been when something important was about to happen. Glarus didn't do riots or protests. It did decisions, and once a decision had been made, it didn't look back. Pause. Anna rose early. She had slept very little the night before, though whether from fear, anger, or simple exhaustion, no one could say. No one asked. A guard brought her bread and water. She thanked him. Not because she felt grateful, but because habit still had power. There were no visitors, no priest, no last-minute letter from someone higher up the chain. Just the sound of footsteps in the corridor and the rustle of fabric as she prepared herself for the last thing she would be expected to do. She wore the same clothes she had worn during her trial. They were clean, not elegant, not symbolic, just appropriate. That too seemed important. No part of this was allowed to become dramatic. It had to look controlled, dignified, efficient. When the time came, she followed the guards without hesitation. The walk was short. Glarus was not the kind of town that stretched itself unnecessarily. The platform had been assembled the day before. Simple, wooden, unadorned. A few people stood nearby, not out of malice but curiosity. This was history, after all, and history When it happened at home, was worth a glance. Pause. She climbed the steps alone. The man with the sword didn't look at her. He had a job to do. Everyone did. Even her. She didn't speak. Not to the crowd. Not to the officials. There was nothing left to say that would have changed anything. The silence suited her. It had been her companion for weeks. Now, it stood with her one last time. And when it was over, the people turned away quietly. No cheering, no weeping, just the return to rhythm. Shops reopened, doors closed. The shutters that had been drawn for dignity were lifted again. Pause. The woman was gone. The story had been concluded, and the record soon enough would be filed away as if she had never been anything more than a regrettable event. Long pause. There was no public reckoning, no debate, no sudden wave of conscience sweeping through the streets of Glarus. The execution had taken place, the sentence had been carried out, and that was that. Pause. For a few days, people continued to speak her name, carefully in lowered tones, but even that faded. New concerns took over. Harvests, markets, illnesses, marriages. Life moved on. It always did. The town had cleansed itself, and it liked the way that fell. Pause. The child recovered. Slowly at first, then more quickly, as if something unspeakable had been removed from her surroundings. Some called it proof. Others chose not to mention it at all. The doctor returned to his practice. His wife resumed her place in the community with quiet confidence. No one challenged their version of events. Why would they? Pause. Anna's name disappeared from daily speech. Her belongings were discarded. The house she had once worked in was cleaned top to bottom, the way one might clean after a bad smell. Thoroughly, but without discussion. Nothing marked where she had gone. No grave with a name, no plaque on the wall. Just absence, folded neatly into memory. Pause. And yet, for all the town's efficiency, something lingered. A tension. A quiet shame no one would admit aloud. They had not burned her. They had not called her a witch. They had simply removed her. And somehow, that made it easier to forget. And harder to forgive. Long pause. Sometime after the execution, the official documents from Anna's trial were quietly removed from the courthouse archives. No formal announcement was made, no decree, just a discreet order, a few trusted hands, and the slow disappearance of papers that had once been read aloud with conviction. Pause. The records were taken to the Linth River. It wasn't far, nothing in Glarus ever was. And the spot had likely been chosen not for symbolism, but for convenience. A simple location, quiet, private. Pause. There, under the soft light of a late afternoon, the pages were cast into the water. Not burned. Burning left smoke. Burning left questions. Paper, when released into a current, simply drifts. It blurs, softens, disappears. Pause. There are no surviving details of who stood there as the papers floated away. No names attached to the act. Only the fact that it happened, and that no one tried to stop it. For all the order and record-keeping that Swiss governance prided itself on, this particular file was allowed to vanish. Pause. Perhaps they told themselves it was for decency. To spare the family. To avoid further embarrassment. But the truth was simpler. It's easier to move forward when the trail behind you has been swept clean. Pause. What remained were whispers, contradictions, gaps in the timeline, enough to build a rumour, too little to build a defence, and far, far too late for justice. Long pause. Anna Göldin was never supposed to be remembered. Her story had been erased with the precision of a state that preferred order over memory. The records were gone, the name unspoken, the act completed. But silence has a way of echoing, especially when it's forced. For years, her name lingered at the edges of conversation. She became a cautionary footnote, a shadow passed between midwives and old women, a quiet warning not to ask too many questions, not to speak too freely. She wasn't talked about publicly, but in private she was hard to forget. Pause. Over time, the story began to shift. Details softened, changed, retold with different tones depending on who was doing the telling. Some described her as a victim, others as a servant who had crossed a line no one could quite define. But slowly, her story slipped out of control. It no longer belonged to the town, it belonged to curiosity. Pause. Historians began to take notice. Writers asked questions. Researchers tried to reconstruct the events from what little remained. Old letters, vague reports, fragments of official language left behind by accident or oversight. What they found wasn't just a trial, it was a society trying to convince itself that what it had done was necessary, that the choice, once made, had been inevitable. In that vacuum, Anna became more than herself. She became symbol. Silenced woman, misjudged servant, last witch. Pause. The irony, of course, was that she never called herself any of those things. She had lived a hard life, worked thankless jobs, raised a child alone, survived systems that were never built for her. She hadn't asked to be remembered. But history, once it loses its fear of you, often begins to look back with interest. Pause. And so, without her permission, Anna Göldin began to return. It took over 200 years. In 2007, the canton of Glarus formally acknowledged what had long been clear to historians, writers, and anyone willing to look the facts in the eye, that Anna Göldin had been wronged. Not just misunderstood or misjudged, but deliberately sacrificed in a trial that masked fear as justice. There was no ceremony, no monument, just a statement. A public recognition that what had been done to her, under the guise of legal procedure and social order, had no place in a society that claimed to be civilized. Pause. By then, Anna had already become a figure of interest far beyond the borders of Glarus. Documentaries had been made, novels written, a museum in her name had opened. School children were taught about her, not as a witch, not even as a criminal, but as a reminder of what fear can do when wrapped in official language. The government didn't use the word witch, of course. That part remained technically irrelevant. They focused on due process, on the failure to offer her legal protection, on the absence of real evidence. It was, in essence, an apology crafted in the vocabulary of modern democracy. Measured, professional, and decades too late. Pause. Still, it mattered. Not because it made anything right, but because it made forgetting just a little harder. And because even in a country built on silence and precision, there are names that eventually slip back through the cracks. Anna's was one of them. Pause. Not because she demanded to be remembered, but because the country that tried to forget her finally ran out of reasons to pretend she hadn't mattered. Long pause. Anna Katharina Schudi, the youngest daughter of the household, never gave a statement. Not during the trial, not afterward, not in the long decades that followed. She lived her life in the same town where it had all happened, surrounded by the quiet protection that tends to settle around children once adults have decided what the story should be. Whether she remembered what truly happened was something no one ever found out. The strange symptoms, the trembling, the pins, none of it was ever questioned in her presence once the verdict had been handed down. If she asked questions later, They must have been behind closed doors. If she carried guilt, it never showed. Pause. Those who knew her described her as gentle, quiet, withdrawn at times, but not unusually so. As she grew older, she faded from the center of the story, the way survivors often do when no one wants to ask how survival worked in the first place. It's possible she was frightened back then, that she believed something was happening to her and couldn't explain it. It's also possible she said what she was told, or simply sensed what the adults wanted her to say. The truth may have been something even more mundane. A child seeking attention in a home where emotional warmth was rationed carefully. But whatever the reason, the effect was irreversible. She lived, as far as anyone can tell, a full life. And perhaps that's where the discomfort lies. Not in her survival, but in the fact that no part of it ever circled back to what had happened. There was no confession, no clarification, no story told in her own words. Only the knowledge that her illness marked the beginning of someone else's end. Pause. Some would call that a tragedy. Others, a silence too deep to measure. But in either case, the outcome remained the same. One girl recovered, and one woman disappeared. Long pause. Switzerland has always liked to be seen as neutral, not just in war, but in almost everything. Calm in its politics, modest in its ambitions, and above all, clean in its conscience. It's a country built on precision, on discretion, on the quiet pride of systems that work. And in many ways, that's true. The trains run, the streets shine, the paperwork is in order. But beneath that surface, there is a weight. Not dramatic, not loud, but there, settled in the folds of a national memory that doesn't quite know what to do with things that don't fit. Pause. Anna Göldin didn't fit. Her story wasn't supposed to continue. It was meant to vanish in the flow of time, wash clean like so many things that no longer serve the image. And yet, it returned. Quietly at first, then more openly. Not because the country wanted it to, but because forgetting didn't hold as well as it used to. In the years since her death, Switzerland changed in countless ways, politically, socially, economically. But the part that hurt her most, the calm face of institutional fear, never really left. It simply got better at dressing itself. More tolerant, perhaps. More careful with language, but still uneasy with confrontation, especially the kind that comes from within. Anna's story was inconvenient because it asked something simple. What happens when a nation that prides itself on order chooses cruelty over confusion? When it protects reputation more fiercely than it protects truth? Pause. There are no easy answers. Only the knowledge that even in a clean country, some stains don't come out with time. Long pause. She was not the last woman accused of witchcraft. Not the last to suffer under fear, or patriarchy, or suspicion dressed as law. But she was the last to be executed in a Europe that claimed to have outgrown such things. And so, Anna Göldin became something more than a local tragedy. She became a line in the timeline. A marker. The phrase followed her like a title. Europe's Last Witch. It was printed in newspapers, carved into museum plaques, whispered on true crime podcasts centuries later. She didn't choose it, of course. It was given to her, like most things in her life, not out of care, but out of need. Europe needed a last witch. A symbolic end to an era it no longer wanted to admit had lasted as long as it had. Pause. Her story travelled. Writers picked it up. Academics dissected it. Feminist thinkers found in her the echoes of every woman condemned for being inconvenient, clever, or simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Her name appeared in footnotes and exhibitions, mentioned in the same breath as medieval burnings and early modern hysteria. And yet, she had lived in the Enlightenment, a time that promised reason and delivered a scaffold. She became famous by being forgotten first. That was the irony. Only through erasure was she made visible again, and the version of her that returned was not the one who cleaned kitchens or walked through quiet valleys in search of work. It was the one distilled by guilt and distance and story. People called her brave. Some called her a martyr. Others saw in her nothing more than an unlucky woman who met the full force of social failure. But whatever they saw her. And that, in the long shadow of what had been done, was its own kind of reparation. Pause. Anna Göldin never set out to be a symbol, but history, especially when it regrets itself, has a way of turning its victims into monuments. Long pause. There is a plaque now, a simple one, set near the place where she died, in the town that once tried to forget her. It doesn't shout, it doesn't accuse, it just sits there, stone and metal, bearing a name, a date, a few chosen words. Enough to mark a moment, not enough to carry its weight. Inside the small museum that bears her name, glass cases hold the objects of the time, court documents, faded illustrations, fragments of clothing from that century. None of them belong to Anna directly. The pins are replicas. The signatures are copies. But people come anyway. They stand in front of these relics, trying to feel something, trying to reach back into a story they were never part of, and yet somehow can't ignore. Pause. There are books now, academic studies, historical essays, fictional retellings, some with sympathy, some with distance, all trying to do what the trial never did, make sense of her. But sense is slippery when silence has filled the space for so long. And what remains, in the end, is not clarity. It's atmosphere. Glarus does not celebrate Anna. Not in the way countries celebrate heroes or saints. She is remembered, acknowledged, studied, but not owned. Her name belongs to the space between what happened and what was allowed to happen. The part of history that refuses to become tidy. And maybe that's how it should be. Not a statue, not a slogan. Just the quiet discomfort of a woman who should not have died. And did. Pause. Stone can crack, paper can fade, but silence, once broken, doesn't go back to sleep. Long pause. There were women in the courtroom, not many, and none with a voice that counted. They sat at the edges, watching, some out of duty, others out of fear, a few perhaps out of something that looked like fascination. But they were there. They knew Anna, at least by sight. She had worked in their neighbours' homes, passed them at market, stood behind them in church. She wasn't a stranger. That was what made it worse. None of them spoke in her defence. Maybe they had children of their own and feared what would happen if they were seen to side with someone accused of harming a child. Maybe they believed the whispers. Maybe they didn't. But belief wasn't the only force at play. There was reputation. There was order. There was the invisible weight of knowing one wrong word could shift the gaze in your direction. And most of them had no protection either. So they stayed silent. Not out of cruelty, but survival. In the doctor's household, Anna Katharina Tschudie's mother remained almost entirely in the background. She's mentioned in a few lines, her actions speculated on, but her thoughts never recorded. Some have wondered whether she planted the pins herself. Others suspect she simply allowed the suspicion to grow unchecked. But none of that is certain. What is certain is that she watched as the accusation took hold and did not stop it. And still, she too would have been limited. By role, by expectation, by the soft but total control of a household ruled by male certainty. If she doubted her husband, she didn't show it. If she feared what was happening, she said nothing. Pause. Around them all, women in kitchens and parlours and pews exchanged glances. Not everyone believed it, not truly. But disbelief is a lonely thing when the town has already decided. So they watched, and whispered, and folded their doubts into silence. Pause. Anna died alone. But she did not die unwitnessed. They didn't burn her. It's a detail that gets repeated, almost proudly, as though the absence of flames meant the country had already moved beyond superstition. As though a beheading, silent, fast, efficient, was somehow evidence of civilization. But there was no mercy in it, only strategy. Fire draws crowds, fire leaves smoke. A sword, on the other hand, is clean, leaves less behind, and asks fewer questions. Pause. There was no public ritual, no pile of wood to be lit at dawn, no warning smell in the air, no column of smoke rising behind the church. Her death was carried out with the kind of discipline her country valued, quiet, precise, and without excess. And then she was gone. No ashes remained. No scorched earth. Just the silent knowledge that something had happened and would not be spoken of again. It suited the people of Glarus. They could return to their lives without the visual stain of what they had allowed. Without a burned stake to pass on the way to church. Without the uncomfortable evidence of fire. But absence, as it turned out, didn't mean closure. It only meant there was nothing to point at, nothing to touch, nothing to bury. And so, Anna disappeared. Not into smoke, but into a silence far harder to break. It was a silence that left out more than it ever admitted. Because before the trial, before the pins, there'd already been shadows the records chose not to follow. Before she became an accused poisoner, Anna Göldin was already known to the authorities. Not in Glarus, but in Senvald, further east, where her life had briefly followed a familiar pattern. Work, as it was a silence that left out more than it ever admitted. Because before the trial, before the pins, there had already been shadows the records chose not to follow. Anna hadn't arrived in Glarus as a blank slate. She brought with her the kind of past people didn't discuss openly, but rarely forgot. In another canton, years earlier, she'd fled a household under the accusation of theft. There had been no conviction, no trial, just whispers, a missing sum, and a maid who left in a hurry. That story alone might have faded, but not when paired with the other. She'd also had a child, born out of wedlock, father unknown, the baby didn't survive long. There's no evidence of wrongdoing, but back then, illegitimacy came with its own set of suspicions. She carried that with her too. Not on paper, but in the way doors closed just a little faster behind her. By the time she found employment with the Tschudi family, Anna was already someone to be cautious around. Not because she was dangerous, but because she came from outside, with too many gaps in her story and no one to vouch for her. She could read and write, a rare skill for someone in her position, but even that was a double-edged sword. It made her useful, yes, but also unusual. And unusual, in a world that prized order, was a reason enough for distrust. None of this made it into the trial's official version. Not properly. Not in a way that would allow for context or defense. It was there, between the lines, in the tone, in the emphasis. Enough to suggest that whatever happened to her, perhaps she had it coming. Pause. Facts weren't falsified. They were just carefully arranged. Long pause. Some believed the doctor had taken an interest in Anna. Not professionally, not medically. The kind of interest that complicated things in households where power moved in only one direction. There's no record of a formal complaint, no scandal on paper, but the rumour lived on long after both of them were gone. He was a man of standing, a respected figure, married, established. She was a maid, young, unmarried, alone. If he had crossed a line, even discreetly, it would have been easier to remove her than to defend her. And if his wife had noticed something, or suspected, there might have been other ways to ensure Anna was dealt with, without making a scene. Then there's the child, Anna Katerina, the doctor's daughter, who had once claimed to find pins in her milk and her clothes. Was she manipulated? Coached? Did she believe the story herself? Or was she simply scared and trying to make sense of something she couldn't name? Pause. There's also the theory that her mother had a hand in it, that the pins didn't appear by accident but by arrangement, perhaps to push Anna out, perhaps to protect something more delicate inside the family, perhaps for reasons that were never spoken aloud. And finally, there's the quiet suggestion, too quiet to be written into any file, that the entire trial was about something else, that Anna was inconvenient at the wrong moment, that the authorities wanted to send a message, not about witchcraft, but about obedience, and that a case, with its strange mixture of old fears and modern law, gave them the perfect excuse. None of this was proven, but then again, it didn't need to be, because the questions outlived the verdict. Long pause. And this was the story of Anna Göldin, accused without evidence, silenced without fire, and buried, not in earth, but in paperwork. Thanks for staying with me through this one. Thanks for staying with me through this one. If you found this story worth your time, hit like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. I want to hear from you. What scares you more, superstition or silence? Support more honest, unfiltered stories like this by visiting ko-fi.com/napmax. This is Napmax Sleep Stories, and you've been listening to Anna Göldin, the last witch execution in Europe. Sleep well and keep questioning. Pause.